Imagine walking into a story thinking you know the players, the plot, the punchline, and then someone drops a bomb that makes you question every single assumption you had. That's exactly what happened when Tasha K allegedly revealed what Tamar's DNA test might actually mean. Suddenly, everything we thought we understood about that night with Mendeecees flips on its head. Because let's be honest, the internet loves a chaotic celebrity night. But chaos is one thing, and carefully curated silence hiding something explosive? That's a whole different level. The drama starts before a single screenshot was posted, before a single wine glass joke, before anyone had even refreshed their feeds. Tamar's soft, trembling interview floated around as if it were a cloud of vulnerability. A gentle plea for empathy, a story wrapped in trauma. But Funky's voice cut through all of that like a flashlight in a dark alley. Not emotional, not dramatic, just exhausted, observational, precise, and suddenly, those little gaps, the pauses, the avoided names, they were no longer innocent lapses. They were strategic omissions. Walls carefully built around the one person Tamar didn't want to name. Let's break it down. Tamar, Mendeecees, Funky, Tasha K for names, for perspectives, but only 3 narratives. Tamar tells us she woke up alone, scared, confused, injured even. But she never tells us who walked her upstairs, who stayed close, who shared thymogene walking into a story thinking you already know the players, the plot, and the punchline. And then someone drops a revelation that makes you question every single assumption you had. That is exactly what happened when Tasha K allegedly revealed what Tamar's DNA test might actually mean. Suddenly, everything the internet thought it understood about that night with Mendeecees flipped upside down. Tamar's soft, trembling interview drifted across feeds like a cloud of vulnerability. A story wrapped in confusion, fear, and trauma, inviting sympathy and empathy. But Funky's voice cut through all of that with a precision that could not be ignored. He didn't scream. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He simply recounted what he saw, where she was, who she leaned toward, and how the energy in the Uber shifted in ways that made him uncomfortable. Every pause, every skip detail in Tamar's narrative now looks strategic rather than accidental. She wasn't forgetting. She was protecting. The person Funky saw close to her, the presence she erased, the one who changed the entire dynamic of that night, was missing from her story entirely. And the DNA test that Tasha K brought into the conversation was now the key. That could connect all the dots. People began replaying Tamar's interview not for what she said, but for what she carefully avoided. Every sigh, every hesitation, every vague reference suddenly felt loaded with intention. She described waking up alone, but never explained who had stayed close to her, who had walked upstairs, who had shared the space that Funky described in meticulous detail. Her narrative began after Funky left, focusing only on aftermath, injury, and fear. While the hours leading up to that moment, the hours Funky remembered vividly, were blank canvases in her story. The more viewers examined the timeline, the more they realized that Funky's exhaustion was not weakness, it was credibility. He had been an outsider looking in on something intimate, something Tamar chose not to explain. His account was spatial, moving, full of tension, small gestures, shifts in seating, leaning closer. Subtle glances, moments that spoke louder than any words. He described an energy in the car that tightened, a group dynamic that shifted, a presence he did not belong to, and that instinctive discomfort became the timestamp of the story. Tamar's story, by contrast, began only after the energy left Funky's domain. Her narrative focused on feelings, emotions, and trauma, deliberately avoiding names, sequence, and the architecture of the night that would reveal too much. And then Tasha K, with her calculated timing, dropped the revelation about the DNA test, and suddenly the internet froze. This was not just a casual mention of a medical result. According to her, this test aligned with the timeline Funky witnessed, pointing toward the presence Tamar erased. Suddenly, the omissions in her story were no longer minor lapses but deliberate erasures, shields protecting someone whose identity changed everything. The crowd began replaying Funky's live stream with new eyes, noticing details they had previously dismissed, the subtle intimacy, the glances, the movements, the closeness, the way Tamar directed the night without acknowledging it. He felt uncomfortable because he was witnessing something he was not meant to see. The Uber ride was no longer just transportation. It was a microcosm of hidden truths, a moving stage where proximity revealed connection. And that connection was something Tamar carefully excluded from her narrative. Every time she described confusion, fear, or pain, viewers noticed what was absent. She emphasized her injury but avoided naming the person who had been closest. She detailed the aftermath but avoided the lead-up, the part that explained everything. Funky's exit, described as instinctual, became a defining moment because it marked the point where the energy shifted entirely out of his hands. He did not storm out. He did not argue. He simply left, stepping back as Tamar, and the presence she protected continued the night without him. And Tamar's interview, presented as emotional vulnerability, suddenly appeared like a carefully curated timeline, designed to highlight aftermath and soften, blur, or erase context. People began connecting dots between Funky's observations, Tamar's omissions, and Tasha K's revelation about the DNA test. Her silence, once interpreted as confusion or trauma, now appeared as protection, not of herself alone, but of someone else. Each pause, each hesitation, each skipped detail, every vague allusion became significant. Viewers began analyzing her tone, the careful modulation of her voice, the strategic emphasis on certain moments, and realized that forgetting does not usually occur in such a precise pattern. Voiding is deliberate. Tamar avoided the parts that would answer the questions the test now suggested. She avoided the parts that would expose proximity and alignment. Funky's version, once seen as ancillary, now became central because it contained the structural truth of the night. He remembered what she intentionally omitted, and the revelation of the DNA test reframed the narrative entirely. It was no longer about confusion or trauma alone. It was about alignment, about moments that could not be seen without a witness, and about choices Tamar made to shape public perception. The test, quiet in the background, now had the potential to validate Funky's exhausted testimony. Every detail he described, the shifts in the car, the subtle tension, the presence he did not belong to, began to snap into a pattern that her interview had carefully avoided. Social media exploded with speculation. Screenshots were compared, threads dissected. Replays of the interview revealed more than emotion. They revealed a structure, a hidden architecture of events. Tamar's careful framing, her focus on aftermath over sequence, her avoidance of names, her selective recollection, all pointed towards shielding someone from scrutiny. Funky's precision, his detachment, his insistence on facts over feelings, suddenly became the anchor for viewers trying to reconstruct the night. Tasha K's casual tone, her laughter, her DJ board banter, made the revelation hit harder because it contrasted with the gravity of the implication. The DNA test was not just a medical result, it was a narrative weapon, a silent observer that could confirm or deny the alignment of the night. And the alignment, according to Tasha, leaned heavily toward the version Funky witnessed, the version Tamar never wanted confirmed, the version that explained the gaps, the silences, the erased presence. Viewers began to understand why her interview was structured the way it was. It was not the fog of trauma, it was careful curation. It was protection. Every emotional beat she highlighted was intentional, every skipped moment a calculated omission, every soft tear a curtain hiding the architecture of a night she did not want dissected. The Uber ride became emblematic, a moving stage of subtle dynamics, where closeness and proximity told the story that words avoided. Funky's discomfort became the map, his fatigue the compass. His memory, unfiltered and spatial, revealed the presence Tamar chose not to name. And the DNA test, quiet in its existence, became the thread tying it all together. People began asking themselves questions they had never considered before. If Tamar was truly alone in her memory of the night, why was Funky's observations so vivid? Why did the sequence of his account match logical patterns of interaction and energy? Why did her story always begin after he left, never overlapping the moments he described? The internet began connecting the narrative dots. The missing first chapter of her story was no longer missing by accident. It had been intentionally erased. The presence she protected, the person she did not name. The subtle physical closeness, these were the pieces that the DNA test now seemed to validate. Every viewer who had consumed her interview with empathy suddenly felt the tension of realization. Her vulnerability was real, yes, but so was her discretion. She did not forget. She curated. She shaped. She protected. And the evidence of that protection, quietly sitting in the form of a test, now threatened to realign the public perception of that entire night. The audience could not unsee it. Her emotional storytelling no longer matched the spatial reality Funky described, and the test suggested she had more to hide than she had ever revealed. Fans and followers began to replay the footage, re-examine her statements, compare timestamps, and scrutinize tone with a level of intensity reserved for only the juiciest celebrity exposes. Social media threads erupted with speculation, theories, and hypotheticals. Every paused frame, every word skipped over, every name avoided became fodder for interpretation. Tamar's soft delivery was no longer comforting. It was calculated. Her empathy-driven narrative was no longer inviting sympathy. It was selectively transparent. and Funky's steady, exhausted recounting suddenly carried the weight of truth. The pieces aligned too neatly to ignore. The energy shifts he described, the presence he noticed. The timing of his exit all matched in a way that made her omissions glaring. And the DNA test, sitting silently in the background, was now the potential confirmation. It was the missing key to a night that had been carefully edited in public perception. The revelation forced the audience to reconsider not just what happened, but why it was presented the way it was. Tamar's story, once seen as a reflection of trauma and confusion, now read like a shielded narrative. Funky's testimony became the skeleton of reality, and the DNA test was the evidence that might finally validate that skeleton. Each omission, each careful pause, each emotional emphasis suddenly had a reason. It was protection, not forgetfulness, and the audience, piecing together her selective memory, Funky's clarity, and Tasha K's revelation, began to see a night that was structured, intimate, and purposeful, rather than chaotic and random. The night suddenly began to make sense in ways the internet was not prepared for. Every skipped detail, every vague memory, every softly emphasized emotion in Tamar's interview now had context, because Funky's recollection acted like a spotlight, revealing the architecture of events she intentionally avoided. Viewers began noticing the subtle choreography of the night, the way Tamar moved, the choices she made, who she leaned toward and who she intentionally kept at a distance. The DNA test, quietly sitting in the background, now seemed less like a medical formality and more like an unspoken witness, validating proximity, alignment, and intention. The people who had watched her interview with empathy were now leaning forward with suspicion, replaying every pause, every breath, every moment where she circled emotion instead of facts, realizing that her story was less about forgetting and more about shielding someone from scrutiny. Funky had described the Uber ride not with drama but with spatial awareness, noting where Tamar shifted, how the air tightened around them, and how the group folded into its own center, leaving him on the outside. That instinctive feeling of not belonging suddenly became the most telling part of the night, because it revealed the presence Tamar wanted erased, the person whose proximity was crucial and whose identity could change the entire narrative. People began connecting dots between Funky's detailed observations, Tamar's omissions, and Tasha K's claim about the DNA test. The test, once mentioned only briefly and vaguely, now became the potential alignment that tied together all the small details that had been dismissed as inconsequential. Every glance, every movement, every subtle energy shift began to feel purposeful rather than accidental, and the narrative of confusion dissolved under the weight of intentional omission. Tamar had framed herself as a passive participant, lost in chaos and fear, but Funky's account painted a different picture. She was not drifting through the night. She was directing it, choosing who to engage with, orchestrating the energy, and ensuring that certain moments, certain presences, were never documented for public consumption. And the audience, now armed with Tasha K's revelation, began to realize why the DNA test mattered, why it existed, and why it aligned with Funky's timeline rather than Tamar's emotional framing. It was not about proving a scandal or exposing someone recklessly. It was about connection, about presence, about the parts of the night Tamar intentionally kept private. Every viewer could feel the tension, the unspoken weight, the deliberate silences that now made perfect sense. Tamar's pauses, her emotional emphasis, her avoidance of names, and the selective clarity of her memory were no longer seen as gaps or trauma. They were walls, protective and strategic, shielding a person whose involvement explained everything Funky observed. But Tamar refused to narrate. The social media reaction was instantaneous, people dissecting every frame, replaying every word, and theorizing about the invisible thread tying her behavior to the test. The curiosity became a frenzy because the revelation suggested that the story was not about what happened after Funky left the Uber, but about what occurred before, during the moments he was observing closely. Moments that were intimate, observed, and crucial. Funky's memory, precise and spatial, became the anchor around which viewers could reconstruct the night, and the DNA test served as a silent confirmation that what Tamar chose not to narrate was real. Every subtle shift in her voice, every carefully measured pause, every moment she avoided naming someone now carried enormous significance. The audience began questioning everything, from her emotional emphasis to her selective storytelling, realizing that her vulnerability was authentic but her omission was deliberate. The presence that Funky observed, the closeness she later denied, and the alignment the DNA test suggested were pieces of the puzzle that now fit together in a way no one expected. The night that had seemed chaotic, confusing, and innocent was now understood as structured, intentional, and full of carefully managed proximity. Tamar's narrative had focused on aftermath, pain, fear, and vulnerability, but Funky's account revealed the architecture of the night, showing her choices, the subtle dynamics, and the energy shifts that she had erased. The DNA test became the keystone because it potentially validated what Funky had witnessed, confirming that the closeness, the presence, and the alignment he described were not imagined or coincidental. Fans, followers, and casual viewers alike began dissecting the footage, comparing timelines, noting pauses, and realizing that her avoidance of certain details was not trauma-induced confusion, but a calculated shield to protect someone. The public suddenly understood that her story, while emotionally compelling, was curated. The careful sequencing, the avoidance of names, the selective recall, and the emphasis on aftermath rather than sequence, all pointed to intentional protection of a presence she did not want associated with her experience. Funky's recollection became more credible not because it was emotional but because it was spatial, precise, and consistent. Each small detail, the way Tamar leaned, how she shifted, the subtle energy in the car matched across multiple observations, and now had the potential confirmation of the DNA test. People began replaying her interview and Funky's stream side by side, noting contrasts, alignments, and silences. Tamar's vulnerability, once a centerpiece, now seemed layered with intentionality. She was not simply recounting her experience, she was curating perception, allowing empathy while protecting secrets. The revelation forced the public to reconsider not just what happened, but why she presented it the way she did. Every omission became meaningful, every vague phrase suspicious, every pause a protective measure. The DNA test, according to Tasha K., was not about scandal but about alignment. It did not accuse, it did not explain, it simply existed, quietly validating the moments Funky observed, the presence Tamar erased, and the sequence she avoided narrating. The narrative shifted from confusion to strategy, from emotional vulnerability to deliberate framing. Tamar's carefully constructed timeline, once seen as innocent reflection, now read like a shielded story designed to protect someone whose identity changed everything. Funky's departure from the Uber, described as instinctive and uneventful, became the emotional timestamp for the night. Everything that happened after he left was now framed by her curated memory. Focusing on aftermath rather than intimacy, the DNA test suggested alignment, confirming what she did not name, what she did not describe, and what she had carefully kept private. Viewers began connecting the patterns, noticing that every skipped beat in her narrative corresponded to a detail Funky recalled. Every avoided name matched the one person whose presence shifted the night, and the DNA test became the silent witness that validated those observations. The tension between what Tamar said and what Funky observed was no longer a contradiction, but a deliberate layering of truth, protection, and secrecy. Tamar's selective storytelling, combined with Funky's exhausted clarity and Tasha K's revelation, created a narrative that demanded reinterpretation. Fans were no longer passively consuming content. They were actively reconstructing the night, mapping energy shifts, analyzing proximity, and theorizing about the invisible connections validated by the DNA test. The audience realized that the story's gravity did not lie in dramatic reveals, but in what was intentionally left unsaid. Every omission, every hesitation, every emotionally highlighted beat now carried significance, revealing that Tamar's silence was as telling as Funky's testimony. The DNA test had quietly moved from footnote to focal point, a confirmation of alignment rather than chaos. It validated Funky's observations, the erasure of a key presence, and the careful curation of narrative. The public began to understand that Tamar's story, while emotionally compelling, had never been incomplete by accident. It had been carefully sculpted to shield someone, to control perception, and to emphasize aftermath over architecture. Funky's version became the structural truth, and the DNA test the confirming element that tied every subtle gesture, every avoided name, every skipped detail together. Suddenly, the narrative of innocence, confusion, and vulnerability transformed into a story of intentionality, protection, and alignment. Fans dissected every frame, replayed every statement, and noted the contrast between vulnerability and curation, between observation and omission. The night was no longer chaotic. It was deliberate. The closeness, the energy shifts, the presence, the alignment, everything fit into a hidden framework that Tamar had protected, Funky had observed, and the DNA test had silently validated. The audience, once entertained by emotion, was now riveted by precision. Every small, subtle detail mattered, and the revelation of alignment through the DNA test reshaped the entire understanding of that infamous night. Tamar's curated silence and Funky's exhausted honesty, when seen through the lens of Tasha K's revelation, revealed a carefully orchestrated narrative that protected presence, controlled perception, and made the internet question everything they thought they knew. The night that seemed confusing and chaotic now appeared as structured, deliberate, and full of choices. And the DNA test was the key to unlocking the alignment that had been hidden in plain sight. So now that everything is laid out, the question hanging over all of us is impossible to ignore. Was Tamar really as lost and confused as her interview suggested? Or was every pause, every skipped detail, every carefully framed emotion a deliberate choice to protect someone whose presence could rewrite the story entirely? Funky gave us the observations, the subtle shifts, the energy and proximity that she refused to acknowledge. And now the DNA test allegedly aligns perfectly with the one thing she never wanted confirmed. What does that mean for the night everyone thought they understood? Who is the person she erased? The presence that shaped the energy Funky noticed but she carefully left out of her narrative. Every replay of her interview, every analysis of his testimony, every mention of the DNA test adds a new layer. And the audience is left to piece together a story that is equal parts mystery, strategy, and revelation. So now it's your turn. What do you think? Does the test confirm Funky's version? Was Tamar protecting someone? Or simply controlling perception? Who do you think she refused to name, and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments, dissect every pause, analyze every alignment, and let's get to the bottom of this together. Hit that like button, subscribe, turn on the bell, and buckle up because this rabbit hole is far from over.